All right, that's going. Um, the grades are obviously were posted for your papers. If you have any questions or concerns about those, you should meet with me individually. Um, one of the things I've found with respect to comments on papers, when I was first in graduate school, there's never any training to teach. So what we did was we kind of taught each other. And one of the things that I figured out pretty early on was that, sorry, sore neck. Um, a lot of people don't read comments, and I don't blame them in my case because my writing is terrible. But this is typing. But again, my experience is that people don't read comments. Not that no one does, but that most people don't. So what I'll usually do is I'll try and say, okay, here are some things you need to think about. But the idea is, if you want to talk about the paper, we can talk about the paper. That's going to be more productive than me, sitting around and trying to write things that you may or may not even read, or that if you do try to read, you might not understand. So again, if you if you looked at the paper and you looked at how I evaluated it, and those two things don't seem to connect in terms of what your expectations were and what you got, then you should email me. We can set up a Zoom time, either my noon to 1 office hour or another time that works for you, that also works for me, which is most of the day. Um, Other than that, I'm going to assume that you've gotten it, you see your grade, and it's within that area that you expected somewhere. Um, I think the main observation there is I'm still almost in every case, I'm getting rough drafts. I'm not getting completed papers. Um, I can tell by the obvious mistakes that are made that if someone had taken a second look at this paper, that would never have been submitted. So again, it's your responsibility, it's your work, and you're the one who has to stand by it. But I'm going to mention again that if you want to do well in this, and in fact, in any work that you submit, don't give your first work. Your first work is never your best work. Okay. Any other questions on the last written assignment? All right, then let's dive right in with the presentations, and I think we'll just take them in the order that they're listed. Um, the Scotchball article will actually make a different kind of sense to you if you read the third article before you read that. Sipley's discussion is long and it's a little rambling, but it's a comprehensive history of the development of American social science, but more particularly focused on the kind of bringing in and then taking away, and now reluctantly maybe bringing back in the state. And he tries to explain why. So if you want to take those out of sequence, I'll leave that up to you. Um, but let's open first with this alternative theories of the state. This is just a book review. It's very brief and it's a flyover. Okay. If you just read this piece, it won't make sense to you. Okay. In other words, the intention here was you would read that and you'd think, oh, they're talking about this thing, the state. And it would show you they're talking about it in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of disagreement on how the state should be interpreted or how it should be applied or whether or not it should be applied. The second article, Scotchpole's article, is a follow-up on her own work. And she was one of the key scholars in this notion of reintroducing the concept of the state from about 1979 on, let's say 1980s. The state became once again a kind of a focus of American social science, but it first had to displace a lot of other schools of thought. And then the third one is a more comprehensive history of that helps if you know some American history. But if you don't, I can explain and fill in the gaps from whatever is not clear from the presentations. So let's start first with alternative theories of the state. What are we supposed to make of that?
So I read this article, or this book review. What I got from it was basically there's this dominant idea of the state, which he calls like a neoclassical approach. And that is like the dominant idea with state theory.
Okay, what is that idea? What is the neoclassical notion of the state?
So basically, it's the thought that the state is, he calls it a night watchman. So I think of that as like overseeing everything, and it has the power to intervene, but doesn't unless it's necessary.
Okay, let's think about that first, though. That metaphor of the night watchman. A night watchman does not oversee a facility. I know because I worked as one, okay, back in another life, right? You don't oversee anything. You're not the boss of anybody. That's an important distinction. All you're there to do, if you're a night watchman, all you're there to do is to make sure that no one does any harm, right? Okay, so that neoclassical notion is, look, what really is driving everything is market forces and entrepreneurial energy and things like that, all right? That neoclassical notion of individuals making rational choices and things like that. That's, the neoclassical approach is very much rational choice, okay? Methodological individualism. All the night watchman does is make sure that none of the rules are violated. Nobody breaks in and breaks anything, okay? So now go ahead.
Okay. So going off that, the book also argues that with that neoclassical idea, there's not enough focus on the economic powers that big businesses have, and also on individual influence, or the influence of social environments on individuals. And that's where the alternative theories come in, because the alternative theories have to do with, mainly in this review, the alternative theories mentioned mainly have to do with economics, and they kind of fill in an economic gap. And basically the book review goes through all of, like, there's 8 different theories in there, alternative theories. The book goes through all 8 of those and explains those. A lot of them have to do with economics and different notions that they have about the state should deal with this part of economics and that sort of thing. I can go through each of those, but I don't think that's necessary.
What I'd rather have you do that, I mean, we can all individually read those and read the summaries, but there are some conclusions that the reviewer makes, that the reviewer draws in reviewing that book.
Mm-hmm.
And those are kind of important.
Yeah, so I would say the conclusions that he draws are that a lot of these alternative theories are very similar, and they have, if they communicated and work together, their ideas can like mesh and get along, sort of. But on the other hand, some of them have like fundamental differences. And he describes those differences as, there's the theories that contribute or add to like existing ideals of the state. And then there's the theories that want to overthrow the government and, well, not overthrow the government, but they're calling for radical change. Like there's one theory that's a Marxist, it's based off of Marxist theory. And with that, they're saying, oh, the state is for capitalist gain, and they want to change that entire notion of the state, which has to do with, you know, radical change. Whereas other ideas like the institutionalist view would be like that the already ideas that we have of the state, where, oh, the state protects the borders and the institutions are for this. So there's fundamental differences within the theories that the guy who's writing the book review says they will never get along or be able to share the same ideas.
All right. Questions or comments? Any other observations from that? Okay, it's not really clear from that. This is the sort of the dilemma of assigning written work to read in the 21st century, is I never know, do I use the really short pieces that are really condensed because I hope that people will read them, or do I use longer pieces because there's simply more information in them, and like the why the state was dropped in the first place article. I'm not sure there's a right answer to that, so I put both of them in there. I want us to think about this concept of the state. And um, Maria, you pointed out a couple of really important things that I want to make sure people remember when you're thinking about the state. And one of them is there are different interpretations of what the role of the state is, or what in structural functional terms, it's hard to analyze because it's not a single structure. It's a complex of structures, right? It's a complex of institutional formations. But there's disagreement on either what the role of that complex institutional arrangement is or on what it ought to be. Now, one of the things that Maria mentioned was this sort of Marxist, or actually more accurately, probably neo-Marxist notion of the state. There are two versions of that are presented. One of them purports to be more specifically Marxist. You'll hear it sometimes referred to as an instrumental or instrumentalist theory of the state, okay? And I would probably write this down, okay? And the idea is that the way to understand the authoritative institutions of power, the state, is as the instrument of the demands of the ruling class, okay? Now, we're going to come back to that when we look at Skocpol's work, because one of the things she talks about is the failure of states, and that sometimes the failure of that state is explained by a malfunction in the relationship between powerful economic concentrations and the state. And when those sort of fall apart, or when those hold together to the disadvantage of the rest of society, that can actually weaken a state, okay? But the Marxist notion originally was either that the state is an instrument of the ruling class, or in later work, since Marx never really advances a coherent theory of the state himself, that the state is best understood as the arena of class conflict. Okay, that it's the area in which class conflict is fought, is mediated. Okay, and so the institutions of the state do tend to embody the interests of the ruling class. Okay, because the ruling class is generally more likely to be supported by the state than when people outside the state try to appeal to the state for something that the ruling class won't give them. Okay, what they're doing is they're using the state to try to go up against the ruling class. So it becomes this institutional arena of conflict. Okay, which is a little bit different than just the reflexive notion that, well, the state is just there to do anything the ruling class wants. That Marx never really said that. Engels never really said that. I'm not even sure Lenin ever really said that. Of course, he couldn't say that because a lot of what he was writing was in the existence of the Soviet state. So he had to be careful about that. But so that's sort of that Marxist notion. Okay. Now that's very different from the more kind of neoliberal or neoclassical notions of the state as being either, like you pointed out initially, the sort of night watchman. The only thing the state's there for is to, enforce existing law, and keep an eye on things and make sure that nothing gets broken. Other than that, the state has a relatively minimal role. That is, the state is not necessarily responsible for socializing people. The state's not responsible for educating people, in the sense of, making sure that everyone's literate or something like that, that's best left to social forces, okay? Does the distinction make sense? Because it's really important that you understand that. The reason why it's so important for comparative politics is because even though, as Maria suggested, a lot of these perspectives appear to be economic, that's because what we'll see when we look at the third article is the state was acknowledged to be an engine of development, but that ultimately it was kind of like the Marxist notion of communism in a way, in that it was like, well, initially you might have to use the state to intervene, and the state might have to make sure the trains run on time and make sure the laws obeyed, but also the state might have to manage the economy, because these, particularly in post-colonial societies after the Second World War, These are nascent, kind of communities in the process of becoming. They're nations in the process of becoming. They're rules of law and institutions that are untested and new, and therefore they're fragile. And so we have to protect the state, but we also have to use the state to guide development, because there's not a sufficient critical mass of private infrastructure, either in terms of land, labor, or capital, in order for the economy to evolve while still protecting, freedom or security or whatever. So the state's very important to development, okay? But the idea is that the ultimate goal is, ironically, as weak as possible a state. That is, a state with very limited autonomy, okay? And so another thing I would make a note of here as we transition to the next presentation is this notion of state autonomy, okay? Because the idea of a strong state, you'll hear people refer to strong states or weak states. A strong state maximizes autonomy. Now, what does it mean for something to be autonomous?
It rules itself.
Yeah, self-ruling. Now, when you talk about the state as being autonomous, what happens to the people?
They're left out from any decision making.
Right. Essentially, yes. So the idea is that the state has a certain latitude, and it varies from state to state, right? The state then has a certain latitude to make decisions while remaining autonomous of anything that the people can do to stop them. And that's built into the state. That capacity to act with autonomy and to act decisively and to sort of get ahead of what, the people might be demanding. That's an important notion in state theory. It also, as we'll see, is something that makes very nervous the cold warriors on the side of the United States from the 1950s through the 1990s, certainly the 1980s, right? Because autonomous states are looked at as dictatorships. And that's supposed to be the great enemy. The whole way that the United States validates its side and its interest in the Cold War is that it's acting in the interest of freedom and democracy. So if you're acting in the interest of freedom and democracy, and yet you have a state that's acting and it's just aloof of the demands or desires of the people, that's a pretty fundamental contradiction. Okay, we'll come back to that. Any other questions on that? I mean, it's a very superficial overview. I only put it in there because there are some concepts in there I want you to think about. I'd like you to understand, for example, what neoliberalism and neoconservatism are. There are distinctions there, and they're important because they inform these notions of the state. The other thing about the state, and then we'll move on, is when Maria first said, gee, a lot of these things are economic, they appear to be. The idea is, with theories of the state, this concept of what's called political economy. That is, the study of the state is the study of the inextricable linkage between politics and economics. That is, economic performance is a consequence of public decision-making, the actions of the state, of state institutions, because states establish the legal parameters of market exchange. So just by existing, the state intervenes in the economy, okay? And so the evidence of that, often for many people, is economic activity, okay? So it can appear that all they're talking about is economics. One way to argue about that is, yeah, what else is there to talk about? Ultimately, everything does get down to, the deployment of value in some way, the allocative, mechanisms of a society. That's the state. What allocates resources? Well, you have two possible responses to that. One is markets, right? In other words, resources are allocated naturally through a market environment of exchange, right? Either in classical economics, as a consequence of production and supply and demand, or neoclassical economics, which is really more concerned with individual level rational decision-making within a market environment, okay? And that's how resources are allocated. Another way of looking at that is, no, the state allocates resources. The state allocates the revenues it gathers through taxation. The state redistributes value in a way that companies really don't and can't. Ultimately, what we've seen is that those two things really, you can't really realistically separate them anymore. The modern capitalist state, for example, is just that. The notion of a ruling class, for example, is a fusion conceptually of politics, ruling, and economics, class. Okay? So it's not just that they're just talking about the economy, even though, Maria, you're right. Sometimes it looks like, so what is this, an econ class? No, because I'm not fit to teach an econ class. And the first person to tell you that will be Professor Peterson. But because, in order to make sense of this, it's a really good idea if you understand essential economics, if you understand, macro and microeconomics. It's one of the reasons why, we had given some thought to actually requiring either micro or macroeconomics within the major at one time or another. Hughes could teach 201, 202 for sure, though. Well, yeah, I could. Yeah, of course I could. I mean, anybody with an advanced degree and an interest in the subject could do that, because there's a great literature to help you. You just sort of follow the existing literature. But as far as complex economics and things like that, no, I'm going to leave that to the experts. So what I want you to be thinking about then is, okay, all the things I teach are about power. Everything I teach is about relations of power. Well, political power doesn't exist in a vacuum, nor does economic power. Okay, that they coexist within the same environment. What we're trying to figure out with things like theories of the state or structural functionalism or rational choices, what's the nature of the environment within which power is exercised? How does it work? What does it look like? What's the neighborhood look like? What do the streets look like? What do the houses look like? And that's what the study of political economy is intended to illuminate in some way. So if you start getting confused, initially that's okay, but just keep reminding yourself what I'm trying to do is not see how economics and politics are separate. That is, what's the dividing point? I'm trying to understand there doesn't need to be one. What I'm trying to understand better, to my satisfaction as a student, is how do those things work together and to produce outcomes? Now, do you see how, for example, that's different from structural functionalism? Okay, structural functionalism did include the private sector, but only in things like interest groups. Most structural functionalism, and especially things like pluralism, assumes a pretty level playing field. Like, an enterprise like a corporation is counterbalanced by the massive numbers of people in a marketplace of ideas or something like that. What state theory says is, no, that's nonsense. That's nonsense. That doesn't exist. Okay, and not just Marxist state theory, but all state theory tends to say, no, there's this big, powerful being in there, and it's the state. Okay? So far, so good? Any questions? All right. What do we want to do next? Do we want to do Scotch-Pole, or do we want to do the longer piece on why the state was dropped in the first place? What do you think? Those of you who are going to present.
If it makes more sense to do that one first, I guess do that one, but I'm ready to go.
Okay, you want to just go ahead and go? I mean, I'm assuming you've read all of them, but.
I only read the one that I was assigned, which because
okay, well, eventually you will. All right. Why don't we, is it okay if we do the third one next?
That's fine, yeah.
I think you'll see why. Are you ready?
It'll probably make a lot more sense.
I think it will.
I'm ready. I just haven't talked to Caden about what
I'm ready
parts
as
we're
well.
both
It's
talking
fine.
about.
You'll do fine.
because We didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Do the best you can.
I'll just kind of fill in whatever somebody else has to say.
I think that's the thing to do.
I can start off with what I thought to be the main point of it to be.
Okay.
So I took the main reason from the paper as to why the United States dropped their statist attitude that they had gotten from Germany and that academia from there in the 1890s was after World War I and the start of the New Deal and all that with Roosevelt. He became very into trying to prove that his economic policies were not totalitarian, and in doing so,
What period of time are you talking about now?
like the 1930s, like 29 to 37, 8, 9, something like that.
Okay,
Is that the New Deal period, right?
it is, but that doesn't quite square with the timeline of the article.
No, I'm saying that was the main start of the doctrine of totalitarianism versus freedom that became so pervasive up until the late 90s.
Okay, but what you had just said you were going to do is tell us what the essential argument is. So what's the essential argument of the piece?
Oh, okay, sorry. So the essential argument of the piece is that because the United States split into this doctrine of freedom versus totalitarianism, it shifted to a dogma or whatever of having a very lax state in the terms of in comparison to the totalitarian regimes of Europe.
Are you saying that in fact the American state became weaker?
Not that the state became weaker, but that there were more civic liberties offered to the people of the Americas in comparison to like Soviet Russia, for example.
And what does civil liberties have to do with the power of the state?
I don't know.
Okay. Well, no, you're almost there. You're almost there. Shelby, do you have any insights on that?
My main points were that pretty much America being dropped from the American social science was, yeah, totalitarianism. And then pretty much the frameworks of pluralism and structural functionalism neglect the ideas of the capacity of states pursuing goals and its very society-centered frameworks, as said in the piece.
Right, right.
But then the ideas of Weberian's understandings, which are essentially putting yourself, a researcher, in someone else's shoes, was also something that was brought up, which has to do with the understanding of potential autonomy. Let's see. It was kind of complicated. I'm trying.
Well, it is. No, it is
Yeah.
complicated. Both of you are doing fine. This is a complicated article, but there's a lot in there that will help you make sense of this concept of the state. So let's start with the first assumption. Okay, the first assumption, and you both kind of indicated that, was that when American social science was evolving, let's say at the end of the 19th century, okay, it was overwhelmingly influenced by German intellectuals, okay? And obviously, Germany, being Germany, had a history of strong states and that understanding of the centrality and the central importance, either of the strong aristocratic state or of the post-aristocratic state later, but that idea of concentrated power that can act autonomous of the people as a sovereign entity of some kind, right? You both indicated that in some way. And at that time, remember, this wasn't looked at as totalitarianism or, anything evil. It was inevitable. That this is Max Weber's theory of the state has to do with the inescapable conclusion that the state has to be able to act autonomously at times, even though Weber is also concerned with democracy and freedom and things like that. So that as he's actually balancing a theory of the state, I mean, it's not just Prussian militarism, no. That would be more immediately part of the German experience, but this is throughout Europe. It's throughout Europe. Remember that the first initial central power that existed prior to modern nation states was the church, and that unified most of Europe. So as I say, this is something, Europeans have a long history of this. A later version of that would have been something like Prussian militarism. In other words, but that's sort of early statism. So that's the first thing. So these scholars are coming back from Germany and they're starting these graduate programs and they're all excited and faking German accents and everything's very great. And then they realize, wow, we figured this thing out. There's this thing called the state. In the same time, there's something going on in the United States with political forces. And this is this kind of sobering realization by the so-called mugwumps, okay, and even some of the progressives, that their early confidence in maximum freedom and the people and all that turned out to be a lot of garbage, a lot of hogwash, okay? And what they saw instead was corruption. So it was their perceived corruption of both the leading economic forces of the time in the Gilded Age, the robber barons, you know, later the oil barons, all the corrupt bankers, the speculators, all those kinds of people, they were all corrupt, okay? And they were corrupt in the sense that all they cared about was amassing wealth. And if it was at the expense of the common good, they didn't seem to care, okay? They didn't seem to care. And so the only thing that could stop them, it was not the will of the people, because the people were idiots, okay? The people were not worthy of consideration because they were ignorant, and they were willfully ignorant. They were easily duped. They were foolish and irrational and could not be trusted, okay? And so even like the progressive movement early on abandoned this notion of maximizing freedom and empowering people and all that, so that by the end of the 19th century and the move into the 20th century, the progressives are moving in the direction of the mugwumps. They're becoming elitist. And the term that's often used to describe that reform movement is technocracy, okay? This requires, right, the state. This requires an autonomous state. So what they're learning, the first part of the article is what they're learning is, you know, that German notion of the state? Yeah, you know what? They were right. It's not about democracy. But again, it's not looked at as totalitarian or even authoritarian. It's looked at in very benevolent ways, right? The state's the only thing that can save us. Whether that state is a powerful executive that from time to time can intervene, or if it's the courts, you know, that can stand up to these corrupt corporations or whatever it was. Forget Nazi Germany. We're not even there yet. This hasn't got anything to do with Nazi Germany. Okay. Technocrats took over in the United States just as they did in Nazi Germany. I mean, I would remind you that the Nazis borrowed from the United States the theories of eugenics. They borrowed from the United States a lot of the theories of progressive, you know, technocratic involvement in bureaucracy and things like that. They didn't originate all that stuff. Okay. So this was happening around the world. That's why it's, even though the point of view here is America, this wasn't only an American phenomenon. This was America embedded in the rest of the world. So the first part of this is, you would think then that American social science would be very statist oriented, all right? And most American social scientists were not particularly democratic. Political science in particular was a very conservative discipline. It was not a discipline that had a lot of confidence in the people. And it instead put its confidence in experts. That's where this notion of technocracy comes from, rule by experts, okay? So then what happens? Then we get into, this is kind of where Caden is. Then all of a sudden we hit that period from, say, the New Deal through the end of the Second World War. And what's going on there? It's not an immediate abandonment of the state, by the way. It's not. But what happens? That's kind of chapter 2. You know, we have the New Deal. We have a lot of state intervention in and management of the economy. But we're ostensibly doing that to fight fascism. You know, even though fascism hasn't really kicked in yet. The real concern in the United States in the 1930s was either communism, that is a socialist uprising by the people, or fascism by the wealthy. We get into the Second World War, and this is important. It was the last time, and really the only time, that the entire industrial economy of the United States was mobilized for war. That's part of the meaning of what's called total war, where every industrial enterprise had to contribute to the war effort. You couldn't buy an American car brand new because they weren't making them.
Yeah.
Okay, they were making Jeeps and tanks and, you know, flying fortresses and fighter planes.
There's a part during this New Deal that as everything was becoming autonomous as far as the state, the rest of the paragraph or the rest of the page of page 11 pretty much explains that higher ups were government projects, excuse me, and programs were taking on too many projects and then in the name of national interest. So it was, they were doing too much. And it's kind of, let's see.
What
Do you
do
have,
you mean they were doing too much? Too much of what?
let's go back and see if I can.
Tell us where you are in terms of pages.
It says on page 11 some things about these ideas. So let's see.
I assume you mean page 167.
Oh, yes, 167.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. It says if organized interest groups had some influence over how these programs were implemented, they were but backseat drivers compared to the combined forces of executive leadership and independent agency planning. So,
But this really, the period of time they're talking about here is after the Second World War.
yeah.
New Deal's over, war's over. Let me see if I can clarify, because you're in the right spot for sort of chapter 2. That is,
Okay.
one of the things that the American people accepted that a lot of people thought they would never accept as a consequence of the New Deal and the significant interventions and expansion of power of the war, the expansion of the executive branch after the Brownlow Commission in 1933, all of those things. We saw this big, huge executive state that the country had never seen before. After the war, most of that didn't go away. And in fact, the executive branch continued to proliferate, okay? 1947, we have the National Security Act, right? That creates the CIA and it creates a bunch of other things. And we have the National Security Council and a lot of these things that, again, expand the power of the executive branch, not only in foreign affairs, but also in domestic affairs, okay? Initially, the majority of the American people accepted all of that because as a consequence of the interventions of the New Deal and the shock of the Depression, a majority of Americans, even as late as the early 1960s, felt that the government should guarantee them a job. Now imagine, compare that to like, the 70s and 80s, when Reagan came to power, that was gone by then. Okay, some people argue it's actually coming back, that your generation will be like the generation after the Depression in terms of saying the government should guarantee us education, free education. The government should guarantee us a job and things like that because the private sector can't or won't, right? Well, that was the case, all through the 30s and 40s. Well, let's say the late 30s all the way through the 40s and into the early 50s was the American people were, on the one hand, had tremendous expectations of the capacity of the American state to take care of them when they couldn't take care of themselves. We also had allowed organized labor, to expand its power. So this was a period where the middle class was growing very fast. When the middle class grows, expectations grow. But these expectations were linked to a powerful state. We believed we could use government either in the form of education or science or whatever it was to fix what was broken. And we believed more strongly in social engineering and things like that. But that notion of social engineering goes all the way back to the 1930s. The idea of actually engineering an improved society. That's classic statism and elitism. Okay. That hits its first roadblock, what's called the ideological reaction against totalitarianism, which is where Caden was, circa page 168, with the imperatives of the Cold War. That we can't simultaneously have this big, powerful state on which everyone's dependent and yet say that we're liberating people. Because if you're dependent upon the state, you're not free. And that's simply the fact on the ground. So that was where the pushback came from in the 1950s. And originally, remember, it didn't come from the people. It came from elites. The same elites who, from the end of the 19th century all the way through the Depression and the Second World War were telling us what we needed was a bigger, more powerful, more sovereign state. We're now saying, or at least some of them were now saying, we have to rein in the state, and we have to, primarily because what they were arguing was, we have to liberate the economy. Okay, because that's the real indication of freedom, the innovation of the private sector and all that. That began to be heard a lot, but also this idea that they were referring to the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc as, you know, slave states and all this kind of stuff. Okay. So from that point onward, what happens to the concept of the state in the social sciences? What happens to it? Shelby, you kind of implied it early on.
Social sciences. So let's see.
Because that's ultimately what this is about, you know, the way that we study the world, you know, and human behavior. They abandon, to some extent, according to this author, they abandon the theory of the state and, more importantly, of state autonomy. What's the substitute for it? What do they replace it with?
Don't they replace it with institution or relativism?
Well, not so much relativism, no, but you were right when you said institutionalism of a new kind. This is where structural functionalism comes in.
Pluralism?
Pluralism, structural functionalism.
Yeah, those were some of the
we'll
big
talk
two.
about those briefly. Either one or both of you.
Do you want to talk, Kaden, or?
I wrote a little bit down about the relativists and how they led to a state neutrality and an institutionalized relativism, which was characterized by openness, tolerance, and pluralism.
What period of time are you talking about?
Post-World War II, so 50.
When you say relativist, relative of what? What is relative?
I didn't write that down. I can go.
Okay, I want all of us to think about this. Okay, it's a bad habit to get into, to use a term when you don't know how that term is intended. Always be skeptical of the language. It doesn't mean they're lying. It means make them prove to you that what they're saying is valid. Because, you know, when you look at, for example, where do you first, in the article, where do you first see mentioned the term relativism? Did you make note of that? Also, get used to citing. Even when you're making notes for a presentation, cite including page number. Because then if you blank out, you can go right to that page and you can find what you're looking for.
I think the first mention of relativism is 173 or 172.
I think it's okay. Yeah, it could be.
I think 173.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let me see. Okay, let's see. Yeah, relativistic democracy. Okay, see, that's a little bit different. The reason why I want you to be careful about relativism is this is not to be confused with things like cultural relativism that came about in the late 80s, early 90s. Okay, that's not what this is. And it's not relativism in the sense that, well, everything can only be judged, you know, subjectively. Okay. So where is the, you know, what is relativistic democracy? Is it safe for me to assume that no one else read this? Can I get like nodding heads if you in fact did not read this? Okay. Again, if you see a term like that and you don't know what it is, okay, well, I can help you on this if you want. On page 174, the new gospel quickly spread to the four corners of academia. Academia, right? Democracy then becomes identified with this principle of relativity as contrasted with the absolutism of dictatorship. There is no middle ground. The non-demonstrability of ethical propositions was no longer seen as a logical blow to democracy, but as its pragmatic justification. Okay? Democratic relativism, all right, this notion of, you know, it's not an absolutist thing. We know, for example, that there's no, where's Smith? Yeah, Thomas Verner Smith. Democracy does not require or permit agreement on fundamentals. Okay? The relativist theory of democracy, the central claim of which was that democracy does not require or permit agreement on fundamentals. That is, democracy fundamentally is looked at as creating an environment where there need not be consensus, and in fact, probably shouldn't be. It's this note, Caden, you mentioned pluralism. It's the marketplace of ideas thing, right? Where democracy encourages a variety of points of view because we're naturally contrary one to another in certain ways, as opposed to the absolutism that you get in totalitarian or authoritarian systems, where it's like, no, there's one way, and it's determined by the state or the ruling party controlling the state. Does that distinction make sense? That's what they mean by democratic relativism, or, you know, sort of relativist democracy, is that it's about, it transcends the notion of absolute first principles. Oddly enough, it's supposed to be non-dogmatic, as opposed to authoritarian or totalitarian systems where there is a social dogma or a political dogma. There's a ruling set of ideas that would, you know, cannot have any dissent. We see this all the time in authoritarian and absolutist societies where dissent is not allowed. Look at Hong Kong now, and what China's doing in Hong Kong, right? Clamping down on dissent, crushing that notion of relativist democracy that says, no, we have the right, and we should have the right, and it's healthy that we have the right, that on some things we will disagree with the policies of Central State of China. That doesn't make us bad, it makes us dynamic. The assumption being out of that will come better ideas. Not if you're an authoritarian. If you're an authoritarian, everybody has to be on the same page. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. That's really, in academic circles, not, as opposed to political circles, that's the real struggle. Democracy is justified, in a sense, for its ambiguity, right? Democracy is kind of what you make of it, but authoritarianism is what we say it is. That distinction I want to be really important to you. I would write that down. Make a note of that. And if you want to focus in on this, that section, and Caden, you're right, I would say that it kind of starts with Dewey, but really the last paragraph of 173 talking about totalitarianism and into page 174, take a look at that. Okay. And that'll give you that it kind of explains why so many American scholars abandoned the state. Because the environment within which they were reasoning as scholars, the environment within which they had been taught as students, rejected the absolutism of authoritarianism, of fascism, of Soviet socialism, Chinese communism, whatever it was. Okay? Does that make sense?
So just to clarify, is the idea that the state isn't plural and other actors are?
Well, the idea, in a sense, is almost that the state's not really there. The state is only what the people demand of it. You know, I mean, that's the simplified version of it. And this, in a sense, for all the complexity of this article, this is a simplified version of this argument. Okay. But one of the reasons I thought it might be interesting for you to take a look at it and be challenging, but be useful, is because it gets you to thinking, just as we shouldn't make arbitrary distinctions between economics and politics, we should never make distinctions between politics and academia. Remember, for the most part, we're talking about either private universities heavily reliant on federal subsidies or public universities completely reliant on federal subsidies and state subsidies, okay? And so, you know, people remember where their money comes from. When I was still a student, it was during the Reagan years, okay? To be a Marxist professor, or a kind of, at least someone who was not hostile to Marxism as a student, okay, was looked at as kind of provocative. And that really increased throughout the 80s. By the 90s, this, particularly with the fall of the Soviet Union, it was almost like you couldn't talk about Marxism anymore. But you started hearing from professors, either nothing, because they were all disappointed, or, see, Marxism was bullshit. We told you that all along. Never mind that the fall of the Soviet Union has nothing to do with the failure of Marxism. Okay, it's the failure of the Russian state, you know. But academia doesn't exist in a vacuum. You know, there are reasons why almost all of the faculty walking across campus, you know, share a certain consensus about things. Right now, it's primarily there's this kind of social justice consensus and things like that. And if you differ, if you're part of that institution and you fall out of favor by differing with people, you're sitting in faculty senate and you call out an idea or something like that and just question it, right? That can crush your career. It still can. It can still crush your career. Okay, so it's in that environment of almost kind of enforced consensus. If you disagree, keep quiet. That's a lot of American academia. And don't let anybody try to convince you otherwise. I mean, the idea of academic freedom is important, but academic freedom is something that professors sort of take for granted at their peril, because it's being impinged upon all the time. The same thing's happening with this kind of scholarship. The scholars in the ascendant, the ones who control the American Political Science Association, right? Or the economic conferences, or the social science conferences, tend to be the people whose work is in vogue at that particular time. And that vogue changes, just like fashion changes or anything else, okay? And that's what the author's kind of trying to explain. How did this fashion for the state and technocracy and all that, how did that change? And that's what we're getting with the end of the Cold War, or I'm sorry, the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War, and this notion of absolutism as opposed to relativism, okay? Well, how did the state come back in then? Because it sounds like, oh, the conservatives finally won. And in many cases, nationally, they did, although that wasn't really until the 1980s. It's hard to imagine now that up until the 1980s in the United States, the kind of conservatism that's mainstream right now was a fringe movement, and almost no one took it seriously. You know, it didn't make any sense. Okay, everything changes. But how did the state come back in? That's chapter 3. What changed? Or can you be honest enough to say that you have no idea and that you would like another week to read this?
I know that like the autonomy that was theorized went away, but
Well, except that it came back.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, sure, it came back.
Let's see.
Didn't that sorry.
Go ahead, Caden.
Didn't that have something to do with the economics of the 1980s, though? Like the boom of it with the Reaganomics and all that?
Well, what does the author say? See, here's another kind of misnomer about the 80s and the so-called boom. A lot of that was driven by the state, and almost all of it was driven by debt. So, you know, we have this, just as your generation has this sort of mythic kind of prehistoric notion of what hippies were or anti-war demonstrators or whatever, and for the most part, you think they were really pains in the ass and worthless people. A lot of people, what you're taught about the 80s was that there was some sort of economic miracle and this, you know, this incredible acceleration. What people forget to tell you is all of it was driven by debt. And it was driven by a kind of surrendering of the state to deregulation, which, by the way, did not start with Ronald Reagan. It started with Jimmy Carter. Okay. And the idea that by the 70s, the economy had become kind of sclerotic. You know, Richard Nixon arbitrarily takes us off the gold standard in late 1970, I believe. So Bretton Woods is dead, which was created during the Second World War. That's dead. So now all of a sudden the United States has a fiat currency. Okay, it's just its value is whatever the market says. But in addition to that, there's this idea that we have these years and years of sort of simultaneous high unemployment, high inflation, a period called stagflation. State intervention doesn't seem to help. We aren't really intervening all that much. It's kind of nonsense. And so the idea, the new idea that comes in politically that Caden was talking about was this idea of deregulation and kind of, supply side economics. That is what we need to do to fix the economy, right? Is impose discipline, but not on companies. We need to impose discipline on the people, all right? We need to impose discipline on labor. We need to try to break a lot of those contracts that organized labor has, because the argument is those are what's driving up the prices of everything. American labor is the problem. Okay. Well, what do we do there? Well, one way to do that is strengthen the state and say, well, the state's the only thing that can stand up to labor. But if you strengthen the state, you also strengthen labor, because that's what labor uses to bargain with. The idea there is deregulate. Let people innovate. People's innovation is being crushed by regulation, by the Environmental Protection Agency or OSHA or some horrible, burdensome regulatory thing that keeps these enterprises from being nimble and innovative. And it also prevents the essence of capitalism, creative destruction. As you innovate, you destroy. The theory is, as you innovate, you destroy inefficiency. Okay. The theory of market capitalism is efficiency wins the day. Clearly, that's not always true. Okay. But that vogue right then was something that had always been a fringe idea in the United States, at least since the Gilded Age it had. All of a sudden that comes back. Okay. The idea that, government should get out of the business of social engineering because it's messing up the economy. And if you mess up the economy, you mess up society. Okay. And so, but that seems to me to be a time when the last thing anyone would want to talk about is states and state autonomy, because we're deregulating. So that's why what I'm asking you is, Reagan and all that seems to be, the prevailing view in government is anti-statist, at least with respect to regulation of the economy. It's anti-statist. It's also conveniently used to do things like push back on affirmative action, push back on civil rights, push back on a lot of things that are only there because they're guaranteed by the state. So that all sounds like a period of anti-statism. And it seems strange that that would be the time at which Dennis Scotchpool and Evans and a bunch of these people would sit down and write these articles and say, we have to kind of reconsider the state. Do you see my dilemma? In other words, if you look at what was going on economically and politically, it looks like anti-statism. Reagan Republicans are anti-statist. The current Republican Party only favors the state when it protects business. Other than that, they're anti-statist. They don't want states to protect minorities. They don't want states to protect anybody except the concentrations of wealth. That's pretty much current republicanism. That's pretty straightforward. The idea being, as long as you do that, everything else will take care of itself in a market. But see, that doesn't sound like statism. So what are these scholars doing going back to the state?
Was it a shift in academia?
Obviously it was, but what we're trying to figure out is what could possibly drive that. It sounds like you don't know. And if you don't know, then what we'll do is say, well, that's okay. Let's come and look at this next week. Is that fair to say that neither of you is sure?
I know that Weber's ideas were very influenced in the last chapter.
But we don't know why.
And his views of politics focused on securing political leaders.
Okay, keep in mind that
So-
Weber had been dead for decades. So why his work would suddenly become relevant we got to figure out why.
It was because of the works of Dahl, wasn't it?
Well, you're asking, but
Right. Well, didn't the works of Dahl repopularize Weberianism to an extent? In academia, anyway.
Yeah, but Dahl was a pluralist. Robert Dahl was fundamentally a pluralist. He wasn't a state theorist for most of his academic life. If you look on page 193, for example, one of the things you'll see there is a section that's titled How Democratic States Meet Societal Needs. Okay, there might be some evidence in there that you might want to look at. Because what we're trying to figure out is what brought the state back in. We know it wasn't the collapse of the Soviet Union because state theory was already back with a vengeance before the Soviet Union collapsed and the Eastern Bloc was no more.
Was it the need to defend democracy to an extent?
Not really.
Because in the paper, okay, never mind then.
Well, again, I mean, you know, democracy per se was probably under less threat then than it is now. I think it's pretty safe to say that, you know, in terms of not only within the United States, but globally, democracy is in greater peril now than it was in 1985.
Yeah, I was just reading the Action Theory by Hobhouse, Weber, Durkheim, and Pareto.
Okay, those are with this exception of Derrida, those are all old people who are long dead by the time we're talking about. Okay, what I want you to look at, and what we're going to have to pick this up next week. I want you to look at the last few pages of that with the one question in mind: what brought the state back in? That's why, because understanding that makes Scotchball's article make a lot more sense. Okay. I think one of the things I think is happening here is that because it was a long article, it's like, it almost seems like you kind of ran out of gas at some point in the article. Like, okay, that's a lot to take in. I got to let this percolate. But if you look at that section from pluralism to Weberianism on page 201, okay, how did that happen? What does that mean? How did we bring back in the idea of, you know, of state autonomy? And the central notion as the state of having the monopoly of coercive violence and all that kind of stuff that Max Weber talked about in his work on the state. How did that happen? Okay, and it doesn't really seem like we're ready to do that today. Is that right? Because nobody else has read it, and if neither of you is comfortable with it, then we can't really talk about it, because, you know, we won't remember anything. So I think what we're going to do, and you know, the syllabus isn't a dictator as far as I'm concerned. This is institutionally, this is a weak state. You know, the democratic forces are powerful in this class, and I'm one of them. And I'm saying I don't think we're ready to move on yet. I think this is very complicated stuff. It's not, I mean, you shouldn't feel bad. This is complicated stuff. Figure we got halfway through that. But let me do this then. Let me just really quickly, and then I'll cut you loose early today, because I think this is a lot to take in. Let me just kind of review where we are so far, because it'll show you we've actually covered a lot of ground. Okay. When we talked about alternative theories of the state, one of, you know, what Maria helped us understand was, well, there are a lot of different ways that have evolved, and they're all captured in this one book, or at least 8 of them are, of how we should think about the state. And there are ways in which those varying perspectives are not necessarily consistent, and not just because they're Marxist. Okay, but the sticking points in those theories of the state tend to be around things like the basic authority of the state. I would write this down. Think of it this way. In every theory of the state, there are 3 essential functions, and they all start with an R. Okay. One of them is repression. One of the basic functions of the state is repression. That's what Weber means by the monopoly of coercive violence. Okay, the state has to be able to repress. Another thing the state has to have the capacity to do is regulation. The state has to be able to regulate the behavior of human beings. That is, it has to have the power to govern, right? I mean, think of traffic laws or regulations. Laws on buying and selling are regulations. Safety laws in a business are regulations. So you've got this repressive capacity of the state. You broke the law, now you're in trouble. Now we go to court. Now you go to prison. You've got the regulatory capacity of the state. Well, things have to kind of be done this way. However intrusive that capacity is up to the forces controlling the state. And then the state also has the capacity to redistribute. So, and what that means is the state has and must have the capacity to be maintained through revenue gathering and redistribution. That is, the state won't exist. The modern state doesn't just extract and keep resources. The resources it extracts, it then redistributes in some form of goods or services to others in some way. By the way, it's not all taking from the rich and giving to everybody else or giving to the poor. Economic redistribution can include things like the Commerce Department. That is, we pay taxes so that American enterprises do not have to pay for advertising abroad. We set up a tax system that says that American corporations, if they are incorporated, can write off as necessary operating expenses against their tax liability all the lobbying they do in Washington, which means ultimately their lobbying is paid for with tax dollars. Okay, that's redistribution. Okay, so there are a lot of ways to think about that. So if we think about the state as having this capacity to repress, to regulate, to redistribute, okay, then those are the basic functions of a system, a political system. And so the question is, okay, how do we decide? Who decides and how is it decided? How much regulation and of what kind? How much redistribution and of what kind? How much repression and of what kind? You know, there was another shooting today, an unarmed African-American. As far as we know, I should be careful. The problem is American news gathering is terrible right now, and I can't get a confirmation on whether or not this individual was armed. He was running away from an arrest. He was being arrested on a warrant on drug charges, and as a dealer, I think. Last time I checked, that's not a capital crime. He was shot 5 times. The 5th one killed him. Okay, that's repression. Okay, but it's also enforcing regulation. We've decided to regulate the consumption of certain kinds of controlled substances. The very fact that they're called controlled substances, okay? That's the regulatory apparatus of the state. So there's the state at work. So the question is, who's gonna decide what happens now? Now, the pluralist is gonna say, well, the people are gonna be a part of that, right? Because there are these complex institutions. The structural functionalists would say, well, we have this structure, this criminal justice system, and it functions in this way where, somebody's going to be indicted. In order to do that, there has to be a grand jury, okay? That's the purpose of a grand jury. When you sit on a grand jury, I sat on a grand jury for 8 weeks over the last summer, okay? And one of the things that we did, every day we came in, I was on the Tuesday shift. So every Tuesday we came in, we heard the prosecutor come in and make between 20 and 35 or 40 cases. We had to decide whether or not those prosecutions could go forward. 6 citizens of Jackson County. And we could tell the state, and did on a couple of occasions, no, you haven't satisfied me. You can't do it. Or they'd have a charge and we'd say, this one will give you a bill, this one you can't do. You didn't give us enough. Okay, that's democracy. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, that's part of both the regulatory and the repressive functions of the state. To the extent that the people are involved in that, you can say, oh, that's a democratic state. But if you don't have that, then that's a more autonomous state. If the prosecutor did not have to go to the people in the form of a grand jury to actually get their permission to go forward with a prosecution, then they would be a more autonomous state. Does that make sense? So the jury is a limitation on the complete autonomy of the state, especially the grand jury. Think of it that way. There's a kind of push and pull where in certain ways, yeah, there's certain things the state can do that we can't necessarily stop in the immediate sense. But if we build in these mechanisms where we can deflect it or slow it down, then we're limiting the autonomy of the state. Okay? That's kind of what we're getting at with this whole notion of regulation, redistribution, repression, basic functions of the state. Okay? Okay, so I think what we'll do, Kyle, do you mind waiting until next week to do Scotch Ball?
Want me to?
It just seems like we need to do some more reading and some more thinking before we finish this discussion.
I can read the other one in my, then, oh, there we go.
It might not be a bad idea.
Probably would be a good idea. It felt like Scotchwell was alluding to those kinds of things when you read the introduction
He is.
to the article.
He is. And remember that what part of this is, and some of you, a few of you, I guess, have had classes with me. When I teach this stuff, I don't mind that there's a point where you don't get it. The idea is I'm just trying to stimulate your curiosity about this stuff. Then you go to the material, you get as much as you can. And then my job is to go back with you and say, okay, let's walk through this one more time. And let's see, there's some things here you might not have seen or you might not yet understand. I'm not trying to leave you hanging, but the process of discovery to me is an important component of learning. And if you go through this again, you're going to discover things. And what I've done is, okay, I put a few breadcrumbs there. Follow that trail and see what you find. Okay. And I think it just seems to me that we need some more time with this. And I'm perfectly comfortable with that. Remember too, that we'll go as far as we can with the syllabus. If we can't get everything in, 10-week term, they took a week away from me. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. We'll do the best we can. So it's not like we're going to all of a sudden at the end of the term, I'm going to try to jam a bunch of stuff out there and, all that. Okay. So my sense of it is, unless you disagree strongly, it's the people's will, right? Don't let me be a sovereign state, is that we just let this stuff percolate a little bit, do a little more reading, maybe make some notes that refer back by page number and things, so that, because there's that thing when you're presenting, sometimes you just lose your train of thought. Okay. And then we start with this next week, and then we go from this to Kyle's presentation on Scotch Bowl, and then we do our assignment on the state. We're not ready to do a written assignment on the state right now. We don't need to be. That's okay. That's fine. Is it clear that I'm not like pissed off or disappointed? Okay, it's okay. I mean, this is complex stuff. A couple of you said this is confusing stuff. So we'll work on it till it's less confusing, and then we'll have you try to write about it. Okay. Anything else? Oh, I'm sorry.
The people that did the discussions and stuff today, because I thought you said that we weren't writing about it and then everybody else is. And
That's
then
right.
So if you discuss, okay.
Yeah, that's right. No, I mean, if you're discussing, you're not writing, but you have a harder job. You're trying to explain this stuff to us.
Yeah.
You
I was
see, though,
like,
now
wow.
why I don't want you to write, because it's actually harder to explain this stuff than it is to just write and summarize it. Because when you're explaining it, you have to do exactly that. It's not just a summary. You have to help us make sense of this stuff. And some of it we got. I think some of the stuff we got was pretty good. I think the first part of it, it seems to me that between the two of you, we got a pretty clear idea of how this thing started, the influence of the Germans, the notion of technocracy. I filled in a few blanks there, but I think you had most of that. I think the idea of the consolidation of state power with the New Deal and the Second World War, I think everybody's pretty good on that. We can kind of see logically why there might have been a little rejection of the state from American, especially business elites, right? Look, you nationalized the economy. We don't want to do that anymore. We want to go back to selling, cars to the American people and putting lots of chrome on them and things like that and making more money. We don't want to make war machines. I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. We'll keep making the war machines, okay, because of this Cold War situation. But you got to let us make sports cars. You got to let us make pickups. You got to let us make other stuff. That is, stop regulating us. Let us go. Okay, and you can see this start to happen. But then there's also the ideological component of that, which is this growing concern that democracy can't come out of the barrel of a gun. Okay, even figuratively. That is, you can't just say, okay, this is democracy, do it. The people have to figure that out spontaneously and organically. Okay, which is why pluralism comes into play, even though it's essentially an institutional theory. It plays on that idea of a marketplace of ideas. But what we have to figure out is, boy, that seems like that would never let the state back in. And yet somehow the state came back in. That's the last thing we got to figure out. Okay, and we'll do that next week. Does that make sense? All right, any other questions? All right, then I'll see you next week.
All right. Have a good weekend or